on the evening of November 5, 1997. The bustling environment of Los Angeles International Airport was the stage for what was meant to be a standard, long-haul journey. The crew of Virgin Atlantic Flight 024 reported for duty, their minds focused on the well-established procedures of a flight they had undertaken countless times. The aircraft assigned to them was a modern, sophisticated machine, an Airbus A340-300, a four-engine jetliner known for its reliability and impressive safety record. At just 4 years old, this particular aircraft was in its prime, a testament to modern aviation engineering. The passengers, 98 in total, were a mix of business travelers, families, and tourists, all anticipating a direct overnight flight to London's Heathrow Airport. They checked their bags, passed through security, and made their way to the gate, their thoughts on the journey ahead and the lives awaiting them on the other side of the Atlantic. The flight was scheduled to take approximately 10.5 hours, a long but manageable journey through the night, crossing the vast expanse of North America before venturing out over the dark, cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was one of professional calm. In the left-hand seat, occupying the captain's chair, was 40-year-old Tim Barnby. Captain Barnby was a highly experienced aviator, a pilot with over 14,000 hours of flight time etched into his logbook. Nearly 3,000 of those hours were on the Airbus A340 itself, making him intimately familiar with every system, every sound, and every nuance of the aircraft he commanded. His experience would soon be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Sitting beside him in the right seat was 32-year-old First Officer Andrew Morley. While Morley was relatively new to the A340, with just over 300 hours on the type, he was by no means an inexperienced pilot. He brought with him a substantial background, including significant time on the Airbus A320. Amassing a total of over 4,500 flying hours, his fresh perspective on the A340, combined with his solid foundational skills, made him a capable and reliable partner for the journey. Completing the flight deck crew was the relief pilot, 28-year-old First Officer Craig Maton. His role was crucial for the long flight. He would take over the controls during the cruise phase, allowing both Captain Barnby and First Officer Morley to take mandated rest breaks and remain fresh for the critical arrival and landing procedures in London. Like Morley, Maton was also new to the A340, with just under 300 hours on the type, but he too possessed a solid aviation foundation with over 4,500 total flying hours. As the 13 dedicated cabin crew members warmly greeted the passengers and assisted them in settling into their seats, the ground crew outside was busy loading baggage and cargo into the aircraft's holds. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots were methodically working through their extensive pre-departure checklists. Every system was tested, every gauge was scrutinized. The aircraft was loaded with a significant 73 metric tons of jet fuel, carefully calculated to power the 10-hour journey eastward, including vital reserves for holding patterns or unexpected diversions. With the final checks complete, the cabin doors were sealed shut, and Virgin Atlantic Flight 024 was ready for its journey. Just before 9 p.m., running slightly behind schedule, the massive Airbus A340 was pushed back from its gate. The low whine of the auxiliary power unit was soon joined by the rising, powerful roar as the pilots started each of the plane's four engines in sequence. The aircraft began its slow, deliberate taxi towards runway 24 left. Their departure route was planned to take them west out over the dark Pacific Ocean before making a sweeping turn to the northeast, setting them on a course that would take them over the United States, Canada, and finally out across the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. For this initial phase, First Officer Morley would be the pilot flying, his hands on the controls, while Captain Barnby would handle radio communications with air traffic control and manage the necessary paperwork. Everything was proceeding with a smooth, predictable normality. After a short taxi, the aircraft lined up on the centerline of the illuminated runway. The pilots performed their final checks, and with a confident movement, the first officer advanced the 4 thrust levers to their takeoff power setting. The engines responded with a deep-throated roar, pressing the passengers back into their seats as the 200-ton machine began its accelerating roll down the tarmac. The pace of the runway lights quickened from a blink to a continuous stream, and with a gentle rotation, the aircraft gracefully lifted itself into the night sky over Los Angeles. Captain Barnby then called for the landing gear to be retracted. This was a standard, almost subconscious action, a simple movement of a lever. But unbeknownst to him, to his crew, and to everyone on board, this routine procedure had just set in motion a terrifying chain of events that would irrevocably change the course of Flight 024. As the left main landing gear retracted into its bay, a seemingly insignificant component, a torque pin, worked itself loose. This small but critical piece of metal then tumbled freely through the complex machinery of the gear assembly before falling away entirely, plunging through the cold night air and landing silently on the shoreline just outside the airport's perimeter. In the cockpit, the only hint that anything was amiss was a slight, almost imperceptible delay in the gear's retraction cycle. It was a minor anomaly, the kind of thing that registers but doesn't raise immediate alarm in a machine as complex as an airliner. They had no way of knowing that not all of their aircraft would be accompanying them to London. A part of it was already missing. Left behind on a California beach, blissfully unaware, the crew continued their climb. First Officer Morley engaged the autopilot, and the aircraft began its programmed turn towards the northeast. Below them, the sprawling, glittering grid of Los Angeles offered a breathtaking spectacle. A carpet of lights slowly receding into the distance. The A340 is a hub of constant data flow, with thousands of sensors located all over its airframe, wings, and engines, sending a relentless stream of information to the aircraft's central computers. This data is the lifeblood of modern aviation, allowing the plane to monitor its own health and performance with incredible precision. For the next several hours, the flight was utterly peaceful. The cabin crew began their meal service, attending to the passengers with the professionalism and care Virgin Atlantic was known for. With only 98 passengers on board, the service was efficient and personal. Once the meals were completed and the trays cleared away, the cabin lights were dimmed. Many of the passengers, seeking to combat jet lag, settled in to try and get some sleep, hoping to wake up refreshed as they approached London in the afternoon of the following day. But up in the cockpit, during a routine review of the aircraft's systems, an unusual indication suddenly caught the pilot's attention. A single warning light, related to the brake temperature sensor for the inner rear wheel of the left main landing gear, was displaying a fault. Instead of a temperature reading, it showed two crosses, indicating a loss of signal. In an aircraft as sophisticated as the A340, with its banks of computers and hundreds of sensors, a single faulty reading is often just that, a faulty sensor. It's a minor glitch, not something that typically raises the heart rate of an experienced crew. The pilots noted the anomaly and continued with their duties, their concern level relatively low. What they could not possibly know was that this time, this solitary, faulty signal was not a simple electrical ghost. It was the first subtle whisper of a far more serious and deeply mechanical problem, a problem that had been lurking since their takeoff from Los Angeles and would not make its terrifying presence fully known until they were just moments from touching down at their destination. For the next several hours, the Airbus A340 cruised serenely eastwards. Inside, the cabin was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping passengers and the constant, reassuring hum of the engines. Outside, the world was turning. The Terminator line, the dividing line between night and day, moved steadily westward to meet them. By the time the aircraft had reached the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the first faint glimmerings of sunrise began to paint the eastern horizon with shades of orange and pink. It was a stunning, serene sight for any passenger still awake to witness it, a moment of pure beauty. For the pilots in the cockpit, however, this beautiful dawn was merely the calm before a storm they were about to fly into, completely unaware of the trial that awaited them. Almost 10 hours after leaving the warmth of Los Angeles, Flight 024 began its initial descent towards London Heathrow. The mood in the cockpit was one of focused anticipation, the final phase of a long but successful flight. First Officer Morley was back at the controls, having taken his rest, with Captain Barnby beside him and relief pilot Matin in the jump seat behind, ready to assist. The weather at Heathrow was reported as good, with southerly winds, some cloud cover, but excellent visibility. Air traffic control vectored them towards their arrival and instructed them to expect a landing on runway 27 left. The descent was smooth and routine. The pilots configured the aircraft, lowering flaps in stages to slow their airspeed and increase lift. The speed brakes were armed. The airspeed was coming back perfectly. All that remained now was the final step, lowering the landing gear, just 8 miles from the runway threshold. Captain Barnby reached for and moved the landing gear lever to the down position. What happened next sent a jolt of adrenaline through the entire flight deck. The right main landing gear and the nose gear extended and locked into place with their familiar, reassuring thuds, but the left main gear did not. A loud, persistent warning chime sounded, and the words "gear unsafe" flashed ominously on the ECAM, the electronic centralized aircraft monitor, the pilot's primary flight display. A cascade of related warnings followed, painting a picture of a serious failure. Landing in this condition was not an option. If they attempted to touch down with the left main gear retracted or unstable, the aircraft would likely veer violently to the left, its left wing and engine scraping along the concrete at over 130 miles per hour. The result could be a catastrophic breakup of the airframe, a fuel tank rupture leading to a massive fire, or a careening skid off the side of the runway, potentially crashing into the passenger terminal buildings. The potential for loss of life was immense. However, sometimes landing gear can be slow to extend and lock. There was a slim chance that the system was just lagging and the problem would resolve itself before they reached the ground. Holding on to this hope, the crew decided to continue the approach for a few more moments, their eyes locked on the gear indication lights, praying for the left gear to show a safe, green light. But as the aircraft descended through 1,400 feet above the ground, the runway looming large in their windshield, it became painfully clear that the gear was not going to extend go-around. Captain Barnby commanded firmly. First Officer Morley immediately pushed the thrust levers fully forward and commanded a climb. The aircraft's nose rose, and they began to climb away from the runway, the missed approach procedure now in effect. Captain Barnby keyed his microphone, his voice steady but urgent, informing the tower controller. Heathrow Tower, Virgin 24 going around. We have an unsaved gear indication. As they climbed away from the immediate danger, they immediately attempted to recycle the gear, raising the lever and then lowering it again. But this action only delivered more bad news. Now, the indications showed that the left landing gear had not stowed correctly either. It was stuck in a no man's land, neither fully up nor fully down, jammed somewhere in the middle of its housing. This was the worst possible scenario. Captain Barnby informed air traffic control of their full emergency situation, and the controllers, now highly alert, gave them radar vectors away from the busy airport traffic. They were instructed to climb to 8,000 feet and proceed to the Bovingdon Beacon, a designated holding point to the north of London, where they could enter a racetrack-shaped holding pattern. This would give them precious time and space to troubleshoot the critical problem without the pressure of other air traffic. The first and most obvious procedure was the gravity gear extension. This is a backup system designed for precisely this kind of hydraulic or mechanical failure. The pilot slowed the aircraft to a specific speed, lowered the gear lever, and then pulled the gravity extension handle. This action releases all hydraulic pressure from the landing gear system, theoretically allowing the heavy gear to fall and lock into place under its own weight and the force of the airflow. They waited, watching the indicators with intense focus. But to their dismay and growing concern, the procedure had no effect. The right gear and nose gear, which were already down, remained down. The left gear remained stubbornly, immovably stuck. Whatever was jamming, it was not a simple hydraulic issue. It was a profound physical obstruction. Luckily for the crew, they had encountered this crisis just a few miles from the heart of Virgin Atlantic's operational and engineering expertise at Heathrow. As they circled in the holding pattern at Bovingdon, they were well within radio range of their company's frequency. Captain Barnby contacted Virgin Atlantic operations and, in clear, concise terms, laid out their dire predicament. On the other end of that radio call was a gathering of the airline's best minds, senior maintenance engineers, the chief pilot, and the A340 fleet manager. If this team couldn't help them, no one could. A frantic long-distance troubleshooting session began. The engineers suggested a series of steps, starting with pulling and resetting specific circuit breakers associated with the landing gear system. In case the issue was an electrical fault rather than a mechanical one, the pilots, with relief pilot Matten assisting, located and reset the breakers. They then tried the gear lever again. Nothing. The left gear refused to budge. Another suggestion came from the ground. Try a combination of raising and lowering the lever, followed immediately by the gravity extension procedure. The pilots, their workload now immense, executed the complex sequence perfectly. Again, nothing, no change. The gear was truly and completely jammed. As Flight 024 continued to burn fuel in its holding pattern, a grim realization began to dawn on everyone involved, the crew in the air, the engineers on the ground, and the managers listening in. They might have no other choice but to attempt a landing without the left main gear. This was a scenario beyond any simulator training, a real-world high-stakes test they would have to perform for the first time with over 100 lives in their hands. The potential repercussions extended far beyond their own aircraft. The airport's operations duty manager, upon learning of the situation, contacted the airline to point out a harsh reality. If Virgin Flight 024 crash-landed at Heathrow and blocked one of its two main runways, the entire airport would be thrown into chaos, with major delays and cancellations rippling across the global network. He strongly suggested that the pilots consider diverting to Manston Airport in Kent. Manston was a former military airfield with a long, robust runway, well suited for a large aircraft like the A340. Its emergency services were on standby and could be fully mobilized, and its relative isolation meant a crash would pose less risk to people on the ground. It seemed, on paper, to be the logical choice, but Captain Barnby faced a critical dilemma. Time was not on his side. The four-engine A340, circling and running its systems, was burning through its remaining fuel at an alarming rate. They now had only about 1 hour of fuel left. A diversion to Manston would consume precious minutes in fuel, leaving them with even less margin for error during the landing attempt itself. Before making any irreversible decision, the captain needed one crucial piece of information. He needed to know the true, physical state of the landing gear. All they had were cockpit indications, which could, in theory, be misleading. He needed eyes on, so he made an audacious request to air traffic control. He asked for permission to conduct a low-level approach to runway 27 right, followed by an incredibly low flyby directly past the control tower itself. This would allow the engineers gathered in the tower to visually inspect the left side of the aircraft's S-belly and report back on the gear's actual position. At a busy international hub like Heathrow, this was an almost unprecedented maneuver. But the controller immediately understood and approved the request. Captain Barnby then made a cabin announcement, informing the passengers and flight attendants that they would be making a very low pass over the airport and that this was part of their procedure. They were not to be alarmed. A few minutes later, the captain, now taking over as the pilot flying, lined up with the runway. The first officer handled communications, and the relief pilot managed the checklists. It was a tense, busy descent. As the aircraft neared the runway, an airline engineer sprinted to the top of the control tower, binoculars in hand. With a massive A340 barely 300 feet above the ground, a height barely greater than its own wingspan, Captain Barnby banked the aircraft sharply to the left, flying directly towards the tower. Then, as he neared the center of the airport, he rolled into a right bank, presenting the left side of the aircraft's belly to the engineers in the tower, like a patient on an operating table. The view was definitive and disheartening. The engineer radioed back his assessment. The left main gear was hanging in the bay, only partially extended, dangling at a strange angle. It was clear that it was mechanically jammed and would not lock down. With this confirmation, the captain began climbing away from Heathrow, turning back to the northeast. The hope of a simple fix was now gone. With fuel levels becoming critically low, the A340 fleet manager on the ground proposed a radical, unorthodox solution. He suggested that the pilots come back for another approach, but this time, instead of going around, they should actually touch down on the right-hand main gear. The theory was that the sharp impact and vibration of the right gear hitting the runway might be enough to physically shake the left gear free, jarring it loose from whatever was jamming it. It was a terrifying proposition. To make it work, they would have to land firmly, even harshly, on their one good set of main gear. If they came down too hard, they could collapse the right gear itself. If the plane tilted too far, the left wing and engine would slam into the ground, likely causing the aircraft to cartwheel and disintegrate in a fireball. Even if it worked, they would then have to perform another go-around and come back to land properly, a luxury their dwindling fuel supply might not afford. As the pilots debated this higher-risk option, the aircraft's master warning system chimed again. The low fuel warning was now active. They were running out of both time and options. The pilots were also reaching their mental limits. Having been on duty through the entire night and now facing over an hour of extreme life-or-death stress on the ground, the maintenance team had one last, desperate idea. If they couldn't use the impact of the ground, perhaps they could use force in the air. They asked the captain to perform a steep high-G turn by putting the aircraft in a steep bank of up to 50 degrees and pulling back on the side stick. They would induce significant GI forces, making the aircraft and everything in it feel 1.5 times its normal weight. The hope was that this extra gravitational force would be enough to pull the stubborn landing gear down into the locked position. It was a maneuver far outside the normal flight envelope for a commercial airliner, and it would be deeply frightening for the passengers. With no time for a warning, Captain Barnby initiated the turn. The A340 banked steeply over London, its wings nearly vertical. Inside, passengers were slammed into their seats by the powerful, unfamiliar forces. The pilots, their own bodies feeling heavy, watched the gear indicators with desperate hope. But the seconds ticked by, and the indicators remained unchanged. The gear was immovable. Their final effort had failed. A crash landing was now inevitable. The captain declared a full mayday to air traffic control, the highest international distress signal. The response was immediate and comprehensive. All departures from Heathrow were stopped. All arriving aircraft were sent into holding patterns far from the airport. The runways and taxiways were cleared of all vehicles and personnel. Fire and rescue services, their sirens wailing, raced into position along the designated runway, preparing for the worst-case scenario. The crew now faced their most critical technical decision: what to do with the engines. The official quick reference handbook checklist for a landing with abnormal gear was clear. Shut down all engines before touchdown to minimize the risk of fire from ruptured fuel lines or engine components being torn apart and igniting. But Captain Barnby and his crew knew this was a flawed directive. Shutting down all engines would also shut down the hydraulic pumps they powered. Without hydraulic power, the pilots would lose all control of the flight controls, the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. They would become helpless passengers in a metal sled, utterly at the mercy of physics as the aircraft scraped and skidded down the runway. To have any chance of guiding the aircraft and keeping it on the pavement, they needed control. And to have control, they needed hydraulic power. And to have hydraulic power, they needed at least some engines running. In a brilliant display of airmanship and improvisation, Captain Barnby devised a new, hybrid procedure on the spot. They would land on the right-hand side of the runway to maximize the distance available if they veered left. Upon touchdown, the relief pilot would immediately shut down engines number 1 and 4 to outboard engines on the wingtips. These were the most vulnerable and most likely to hit the ground first. Shutting them down would reduce the fire risk and the asymmetric thrust that could swing the plane violently. Crucially, they would keep engines 2 and 3 to inboard engines running. This would preserve hydraulic power, allowing the captain to use his side stick to command the flight controls. His plan was to use this control to actively hold the left wing up for as long as possible after touchdown, keeping the engines and wingtip off the ground. Then, as the aircraft slowed and the wing could no longer stay airborne, he would order the shutdown of the remaining engines in a controlled sequence. It was a masterful plan that perfectly balanced the risk of fire against the desperate need for control. The captain turned the aircraft onto its final approach for runway 27 left at Heathrow. The atmosphere in the cockpit was electric with concentration. Descending through 1,000 feet, the order was given to the cabin: brace, brace, brace. The flight attendants repeated the command loudly and urgently throughout the cabin. Passengers assumed the brace position, heads down, hands behind their heads, their hearts pounding. This was the moment of truth. The captain guided the aircraft with exquisite precision, aiming for the right-hand edge of the wide runway. The right main landing gear touched down with a firm but smooth contact. Immediately, relief pilot Maton shut down engines 1 and 4. Captain Barnby pulled back and to the right on his side stick, commanding the flight controls to keep the left wing up. For a few glorious seconds, it worked. The A340 sped down the runway, balanced on its right main gear and nose wheel. The left wing held magically in the air, but as the airspeed bled away, lift faded. The left wing began to sink and the captain gave the order shut down engine 2. The relief pilot complied. The left side engine pod then made contact with the concrete runway. Instantly a shower of brilliant orange sparks and a cloud of black smoke erupted, trailing behind the aircraft like a funeral veil. The plane shuddered violently, the sound of grinding metal filling the cabin. It began to skid to the left. Captain Barnby stood on the right rudder pedal, fighting to keep the nose straight. The stress on the right side landing gear was immense, and with a series of loud bangs, the tires gave way, bursting under the strain. The aircraft, now a shower of sparks and smoke, continued its shuddering, grinding slide down the runway. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the massive machine slowed and came to a jarring but upright halt directly on the runway center line. An incredible, almost miraculous silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires being extinguished by the emergency crews who had been chasing them down the runway. The captain's voice, calm and authoritative, came over the intercom, initiating the evacuation. Every single one of the 114 passengers and crew members evacuated the aircraft via the slides, shaken but unharmed. Not a single person sustained even a minor injury. In the aftermath, Captain Tim Barnby's improvised landing and engine shutdown procedure was hailed as a masterstroke of airmanship. It was so effective that Airbus, the manufacturer, subsequently adopted it as the official standard procedure for all future incidents of this nature. The official investigation concluded that the torque pin had failed due to loads higher than those anticipated in its design, leading to a complete redesign of the component to prevent a recurrence. The story of Virgin Atlantic Flight 024 stands as a powerful testament to the value of human skill, teamwork, and cool-headed reasoning under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It was a disaster averted, not by luck, but by the exceptional competence and courage of its crew. If you were captivated by this incredible real-life story of survival and want to see more content like it, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these fascinating and dramatic stories to light. Thank you for watching.